The wind didn't howl that night. It screamed like something wounded and furious, clawing its way down through the Bitterroot Mountains. Above her, the heavy timber of the cabin groaned under 3 feet of snow. But that wasn't what froze the blood in Margaret Ridley's veins. It was the footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching over shattered glass and splintered floorboards directly above her head. Maggie was 64 years old, and her hands trembled as she pressed her spine against the freezing concrete wall of the 10-by-10 bunker she'd carved in secret beneath her own kitchen. Her breath came in thin white clouds. Somewhere above the trapdoor rattled in its steel frame twice as the man hunted for the seam in the floor. She had spent 5 years building this place. 5 years pouring her grief into rebar and reinforced concrete, certain that if she made the walls thick enough, the cold could never take her the way it had taken her husband. She had built it to survive the wrath of nature. She never imagined it would have to save her from something with a heartbeat. The footsteps stopped directly overhead. "I know you're down there, Margaret," the voice said, calm, now almost gentle. "And I know exactly how you built this, so let's not pretend the storm is your problem anymore." And in that moment, Maggie understood the man above her knew secrets only one other living soul could have told him. The wind didn't howl that night. It screamed like something wounded and furious, clawing its way down through the Bitterroot Mountains. Above her, the heavy timber of the cabin groaned under 3 feet of snow. But that wasn't what froze the blood in Margaret Ridley's veins. It was the footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching over shattered glass and splintered floorboards directly above her head. Maggie was 64 years old, and her hands trembled as she pressed her spine against the freezing concrete wall of the 10-by-10 bunker she'd carved in secret beneath her own kitchen. Her breath came in thin white clouds. Somewhere above the trapdoor rattled in its steel frame twice as the man hunted for the seam in the floor. She had spent 5 years building this place. 5 years pouring her grief into rebar and reinforced concrete, certain that if she made the walls thick enough, the cold could never take her the way it had taken her husband. She had built it to survive the wrath of nature. She never imagined it would have to save her from something with a heartbeat. But to understand how a woman of 64 came to be buried alive beneath her own home, hunted by a man who knew the thickness of her walls, you have to go back. Back before the storm. Back before the bunker. Back to the night the cold first came for the people she loved. Back to a stretch of black highway and a phone that would not stop ringing. 5 years earlier, Margaret Ridley had been a different woman. She lived in a quiet suburb east of Seattle, in a house with a wide front porch and a kitchen that smelled of coffee every morning at 6. She was a structural engineer, had been for 31 years, and she had spent her whole career making things stand up. Bridges, office towers, parking structures that would hold the weight of 10,000 cars and never so much as shudder. She understood load. She understood stress. She understood the precise point at which a thing could no longer bear what was placed upon it and broke. What she did not understand, not yet, was that a human heart obeyed the same brutal laws. Her husband's name was Vernon. They had been married 38 years. He was the kind of man who hummed when he worked, who left little notes in her lunch bag long after their children had grown and gone, who still reached for her hand in the dark without thinking. He drove a steel gray pickup he refused to replace. And on the 3rd of February, in the worst ice storm the state had seen in a decade, that pickup was the last warm thing he ever knew. Maggie remembered the phone ringing at 9:40 in the evening. She remembered the way the kitchen light hummed. She remembered everything in the way the body remembers the moments it would give anything to forget. There had been a pileup on Interstate 90. A wall of fog had frozen into black ice across 4 lanes, and 17 vehicles had folded into one another like paper in the span of a single minute. Vernon's truck was somewhere in the middle of it, crushed between a jackknifed freight hauler and the concrete divider. And here was the part that broke something in Maggie that never healed. Vernon did not die in the crash. The investigators told her later gently, in the careful voices people use when they are about to hand you something that will follow you to your grave. The impact had pinned him. It had not killed him. He had been alive, conscious breathing, reaching for the radio with a hand he could no longer feel for the better part of 3 hours. The weather was so violent that no ambulance, no tow rig, no rescue crew could reach the wreckage. They tried. God, they tried. But the storm had turned the highway into a place men could not survive long enough to save anyone. Vernon Ridley, 38 years, married 2 children. A man who hummed when he worked, froze to death in the dark alone, waiting for help that the cold would not allow to come. The temperature in the cab that night dropped to 11 degrees. Maggie did not scream when they told her. She did not weep. She sat very still in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights and felt the load arrive, the full crushing weight of it. And she felt the precise point at which she could no longer bear it, and she felt herself break. Grief does strange things to an engineer. Some people drown in it. Some people freeze. Maggie did neither. Maggie did what she had always done with a problem she could not solve. She redesigned her life so the problem could never happen again. The city, she decided, was a death trap dressed up as comfort. Power grids that failed in a stiff wind. Highways that turned murderous the moment the sky turned. A whole civilization of soft people who believed they were safe because the lights came on when they flipped a switch. She looked at her neighbors mowing their lawns and saw lambs who did not know they were standing in a slaughterhouse. She had believed she was safe too. She had believed Vernon was safe, and the cold had reached right through all of it and taken him anyway. She would not be reached. 18 months after the funeral, Margaret Ridley sold everything. The house with the wide porch, the car. 31 years of furniture and photographs and the dishes they'd registered for as newlyweds. She kept Vernon's flannel shirts and a single box of letters, and she turned the rest into cash, and she went looking for the most remote, unforgiving, defensible piece of ground that money could buy. She found it in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana. 40 acres of dense black timber and granite ridge folded into the spine of the continent where the wind came down off the peaks like the wrath of something ancient. The nearest town was a speck on the map called Darby, 22 miles away down a logging road that washed out in spring and froze solid by November. No neighbors within 10 miles. No cell signal. No power lines reaching that far up the grade. Just trees and stone and silence and snow. To anyone else, it looked like the loneliest place on earth. To Maggie, it looked like a fortress waiting to be built. She hired a contractor out of Darby, a broad-shouldered, weathered man in his 60s named Silas Hartwell. Silas had been building cabins in these mountains for 40 years. And he had a slow, careful way of speaking that Maggie trusted the moment she met him. He didn't ask why a 60-year-old widow wanted to live alone on a mountain that would try to kill her every winter. He just looked at her land, looked at her blueprints, and nodded. "It's good ground," he said. "Stubborn, but good." The cabin Silas built was a single-story A-frame of heavy raw timber, pitched steep to shed the monstrous snow loads anchored to bedrock, with footings deep enough to hold against any wind the mountain could throw. It was a fine piece of work, honest, strong, but it was not the part that mattered. The part that mattered was beneath the kitchen. On the county permit, Maggie had logged it as a subterranean root cellar, a place to keep preserves below the frost line. Silas had built plenty of those over the years, and he didn't think twice when she asked for it. He didn't think twice either when she asked his crew to dig down an extra 10 feet into the bedrock. Though he did pause one afternoon when he saw the size of the rebar order stacked beside the foundation forms. "Margaret," he said, wiping the sweat from his neck despite the cold turning over a length of steel as thick as his thumb. "You storing potatoes down here or hiding from the end of the world?" Maggie gave him a small, tight smile, the kind that ended a conversation politely. "Just want to make sure the frost line doesn't ruin my preserves, Silas." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he set the rebar down and went back to work because Silas Hartwell was the rare kind of man who understood that everyone on a mountain was carrying something, and most of it was none of his business. But not everyone on his crew understood that. There was a man on the dig, that seasoned young restless with quick eyes and a quicker mouth named Dwight Boone. Boone worked the foundation, ran the little excavator that chewed the cellar down into the granite, mixed the concrete that armored the walls. And Boone asked questions. Why so deep? Why so thick? What's the steel door for? Where's the vent run to? He asked them the way a man asks when he's filing something away rather than making conversation. Maggie noticed. She noticed everything. It was the engineer in her, the habit of cataloging every weak point in a structure, every seam where failure might one day begin. She noticed that Dwight Boone watched her bury the satellite phone in a drawer. She noticed he lingered near the pantry when he had no reason to. And she noticed on the last week of the dig that Silas pulled Boone aside, spoke low and hard for a long minute, and that Boone got in his truck and drove down the mountain and did not come back. Silas never explained it, and Maggie never asked. She only filed it away with everything else. That and one other thing, the floor of the pantry. When the crew framed the kitchen, the joists beneath the pantry had to bridge the wide square of the cellar hatch below. To clear the opening, they ran shorter spans there, strong enough to walk on, strong enough to stack shelves on, but not built to the same brutal standard as the rest of the floor. Maggie marked it in her mind the way she marked everything. A weak point. The one place in her fortress where the structure gave a little. She told herself it didn't matter. She would remember 5 years later that it mattered very much. When Silas and his crew finally packed their tools and rattled their trucks back down the grade, Maggie was alone with her land and her cabin and her secret hole in the ground. And that was when the real work began. For 3 months, through the tail end of an autumn that turned the aspens gold and then stripped them bare, Margaret Ridley worked alone. She did not build a root cellar. She built a tomb that could keep her alive. She installed a 1/4-inch steel trapdoor machined to seat flush in a reinforced frame, and she hid it beneath the wide oak planks of the pantry floor, so that even a man standing on top of it would feel only solid wood. She ran a 4-inch ventilation pipe up through the dead center of the cabin's massive stone chimney, terminating it near the flue where no eye would ever find it, so that even if the house burned, even if it was buried in snow, the air would still come. She lined the concrete walls with extreme weather insulation. She stocked the shelves with the patience of a woman who had decided on a cold night under fluorescent lights that she would never again be at the mercy of anything. Military-grade rations stacked and rotated by date. A hand-crank water filtration system tapped into a deep aquifer that ran beneath the bedrock. Wool blankets and mylar sleeping bags rated to 40 below. Chemical heat packs by the case. A bank of high-capacity lithium batteries fed by a solar array she'd concealed in the tree line, and a small propane heater she could run carefully when the cold seeped through the walls. A multi-gas monitor to watch the air. A satellite messenger to call for help, though help she knew better than anyone could not always come. The people in Derby thought she was a grieving widow who wanted to be left alone. They were not entirely wrong, but they did not know that every night before she climbed into her bed in the loft, Margaret Ridley would stand in her dark kitchen and look down at the floor at the seam. No one else could see, and feel something loosen in her chest. Something that almost felt like peace. She had built a fortress. She had poured 5 years of grief into concrete and steel, and she had promised herself in the language of load and stress and failure that she would never be trapped, freezing helpless, waiting in the dark for a rescue that could not reach her. She thought she was preparing for the weather. She had no idea, none at all, that the storm coming for her that winter had a heartbeat and a name. and a partner waiting 2 miles down the mountain. The second week of January brought a stillness to the bitter root that set Maggie's teeth on edge. She had lived through 5 winters now, and she had learned to read the mountain the way she'd once read a stress diagram, by the small signs, the early warnings, the places where the load began to gather before anything visible moved. And the mountain was telling her something. The animals had gone quiet. The chickadees that usually mobbed her feeder had vanished into the timber. The pressure in her ears had a thickness to it, a held breath weight. The little battery radio she kept on the kitchen window sill had been crackling warnings for 3 days, a tinny voice out of Missoula talking about a low-pressure system grinding down out of Canada to collide with an Arctic front. A historic event, the man said. Possibly the worst in 20 years. He said it the way men say things they don't quite believe will happen to anyone listening. Maggie believed it. By Tuesday afternoon, the barometric pressure dropped so fast it ached behind her eyes. The sky over the western ridge did not darken so much as bruise a deep sickly violet, the color of a wound going bad. She stood on her porch in the strange amber light and watched the first gust come down off the peaks, bending the lodge poles like a hand pressed flat against the world. Then the snow began. It did not drift down in flakes. It came sideways in blinding horizontal sheets, driven by a wind that rose within the hour to a sound like a freight train that never passed. Within 4 hours, the thermometer nailed beside her door fell from a manageable 20 degrees to 25 below zero. The inside of her windows frosted over in delicate, terrible ferns, despite the fire roaring in the cast-iron stove. At 6 in the evening, the lights died. Not with drama, just a flicker, a buzz, and then the deep, total dark of a place that has no neighbors and no grid and no glow on the horizon to remind you that other people exist. Maggie was not afraid. This was the moment she had built her whole life around. She moved through the dark with the calm of a woman who had rehearsed it 1,000 times. She lit the battery lanterns and set them where they'd throw the most light. She fed 2 more splits into the stove and watched the heavy logs of the cabin do exactly what she'd designed them to do, drinking in the heat and breathing it slowly back into the room. She pulled a thick fleece over her shoulders, settled into the chair by the fire with a book she'd read twice before, and let the storm rage against the walls she had made strong. The cabin held. The cabin was beautiful. She was warm, and she was safe, and for the first time in a long time, the mountain trying to kill her felt almost like company. At 8:15, the sound came. Maggie's eyes lifted from the page. Thump, thump. She lowered the book slowly into her lap. Her heart, which had been so steady, began to knock against her ribs. That was not a branch on the roof. She knew every sound this cabin made, the groan of the ridgepole under snow, the tick of the cooling stovepipe, the long whistle of wind finding the gap under the eave. She had lived inside these sounds for 5 years. This was none of them. This was deliberate, rhythmic. The sound of a fist, a gloved fist striking the heavy oak of her front door. Thump, thump. She rose from the chair without making a sound. The engineer in her already running the numbers, and the numbers made no sense. The logging road had been impassable for hours. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles away across a ridge no man could cross on a night like this. The temperature outside was 30 below in a whiteout where you could not see your own hand. Nothing should be alive out there. Nothing could be alive out there, not standing on its feet, not raising a fist to a door. And yet, "Hello?" a voice ragged, half swallowed by the shriek of the wind. "Please, please, is somebody there? Help me, God, please." Maggie crossed to the small window beside the door. She scraped a patch clear of frost with her thumbnail and pressed her face close to the freezing glass, peering out into the swirling white. A shape. A man's shape slumped against the porch rail, caked in snow, shuddering so violently she could see it through the storm. Every instinct she had spent 5 years sharpening told her the same thing in a single cold word. Don't open the door. The mountain does not send men to your porch at 30 below. Whatever that is, it did not arrive by accident. Keep the bolt thrown. Keep the wall between you. You did not build a fortress to open it for the first thing that knocks. She stood there with her hand flat against the cold door, and the wind screamed, and the man on her porch made a sound that was barely human. And somewhere underneath it, beneath 5 years of armor, a phone rang in a bright kitchen, and a voice told her that her husband had been alive in the cold for 3 hours, alive and reaching and alone, while help could not come. She could not leave a man to freeze on her porch. God help her, she could not do it. Maggie's hand found the deadbolt. She drew it back. The instant the latch released, the storm took the door out of her hands and flung it inward, slamming it against the wall. The wind roared into the cabin like a living thing, knocking a lantern from the shelf, snatching the heat out of the room in a single greedy breath. And the man came with it, falling more than walking across the threshold, collapsing onto the rug at her feet. Maggie threw her shoulder into the door and forced it shut against the gale fingers stiffening already in the blast, and she drove the bolt home. The roar dropped to a muffled howl. The lantern flames steadied, and on the floor before her lay a stranger, gasping snow melting off him in the firelight. He looked to be in his early 40s, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark green parka torn at one sleeve. His face was raw with cold. His teeth chattered like a held thing. "Thank you," he gasped, dragging the words up from somewhere deep. "Oh God, I was dead. I thought I was done." Maggie did what a person does. She moved on instinct that ran deeper than fear, fetched a heavy wool blanket and draped it over his shoulders. poured a mug of coffee from the thermos she kept warm by the stove and pressed it into his shaking hands. "Drink it slow," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "What happened to you? How did you get all the way out here?" He wrapped his hands around the mug as if it were the last warm thing on earth. "Name's Vance," he managed between sips. "Cole Vance. I was up on the ridge hunting late elk. Storm came out of nowhere. I put my truck off the embankment maybe 3 miles down the road. Been walking ever since. Walking for hours." Maggie nodded slowly. She sank into the chair across from him and watched him thaw in the firelight, and she said all the right things, and she felt the wrongness arrive not all at once, but the way a hairline crack arrives in a beam under load. First a single point, then another, then a pattern. Because Margaret Ridley had spent 31 years learning to see the places where a thing did not add up. The first crack his boots. He'd said he walked 3 miles through thigh-deep snow off a frozen ridge. But the boots steaming by her fire were not snow boots. They were heavy tactical boots, lug-soled military in their cut. The boots of a man who had planned to be out in the cold, not a man surprised by it. The second crack his face. A man who had nearly frozen to death walking 3 miles through a 30 below whiteout should have shown it. The waxy white of frostbite blooming on his cheeks, the nose, the ears. But Vance's color was coming back too fast, too even. His hands wrapped around the mug had stopped shaking already far sooner than a body pulled back from the edge of dying should steady. And the third crack, the one that ran cold all the way down her spine. His eyes. A man who has touched death does not look around a room. He stares into the fire with the 1,000-yard emptiness of someone still half in the dark he crawled out of. But Cole Vance's eyes were never still. They moved constantly, sweeping the cabin in slow, methodical arcs, the windows, the back door, the spot on the wall where a landline phone would hang in a house that had one. He was not warming himself. He was taking inventory. Maggie set her own coffee down very carefully so that her hand would not betray her. And she rose casually and crossed to the kitchen counter, where a heavy cast-iron skillet sat drying on a towel within easy reach of her hand. "You're out here all alone?" Vance asked. And the thing she noticed then was the worst thing of all. The chatter was gone from his voice. The frantic, shivering edge had smoothed itself away into something low and easy, almost pleasant, like a man making conversation on a porch in July. Maggie did not turn around. "No," she said, and the lie came out clean and effortless, polished by some old instinct she didn't know she had. "My husband's out in the generator shed. He'll be back any minute." There was a silence behind her, a considering silence. "That's funny," Cole Vance said slowly, "because there's no fresh tracks leading away from this house, and I didn't see any generator shed on my way up the mountain." The fire popped. The wind screamed against the walls she had built to keep the cold out, and Margaret Ridley understood with the terrible clarity of a woman watching a load reach the breaking point that the storm she had spent 5 years preparing for was not the one that had come for her. She turned around slowly. Her fingers closed around the cold handle of the skillet. Vance was no longer slumped in the chair. He was sitting upright now, the blanket pooled at his waist, watching her with a patience that had nothing exhausted in it at all. "You should rest, Mr. Vance," she said, and she was proud of how level it came out. "The storm's supposed to last all night." "I don't need rest, Margaret." The blanket slid to the floor as he stood, and every drop of warmth left the room, not from the wind this time, but from the single impossible fact that he had just spoken her name. Her name. He had never asked it. She had never offered it. "I need your keys," Cole Vance said, and his hand moved inside the torn green parka. "And I need whatever you've got stashed in this pretty little fortress of yours." When his hand came out, it held a long-bladed hunting knife, and the firelight ran down the edge of it like water. Maggie's breath caught hard in her chest. Her grip on the skillet tightened until her knuckles ached. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. But she did. God help her, she did. Because the man standing in her living room knew things he could not have known by accident. He knew her name. He knew there was no husband. And when he spoke again, he proved he knew far more than that. "Don't insult us both," Vance said, almost gently turning the knife so the steel caught the light. "I've been watching this place from the tree line for a week. I know there's no husband, never was. I know you've got a satellite phone in that drawer by the window. I know you've got a cache, off-grid supplies, batteries, the works. Somebody told me all about it." He smiled, and it did not reach his eyes. "Somebody who helped build it." The floor seemed to drop away beneath Maggie's feet. Somebody who helped build it. She thought of a young man with quick eyes and a quicker mouth running an excavator down into the granite, asking why so deep, why so thick, where's the vent run to? A man Silas Hartwell had pulled aside and sent down the mountain and never spoken of again. This was not a robbery. This was not bad luck. This was a thing that had been planned by someone who had stood in this very spot 5 years ago with concrete dust on his hands and watched her bury her secrets one by one. She had built a fortress to keep the cold out, and the cold had simply waited and learned the blueprints and walked in through the front door, wearing the face of a freezing man. Cole Vance took a step toward her across the firelit floor, the knife low and ready, and behind him, the storm threw itself against the windows of the cabin like something that wanted in. "Now," he said, "let's go get that phone." Maggie did not move toward the drawer. She stood with her back to the kitchen counter, the cast iron skillet heavy in her right hand, and she watched the knife. And she did the only thing 31 years of engineering had ever truly taught her to do. She measured the load. She measured the distance between them, 4 feet, maybe 5. She measured the reach of his arm and the length of that blade and the speed a man of 40 carries when he means harm. And she measured herself. 64 years old, a bad shoulder that ached before every storm. Hands that trembled now, not from cold, but from a body flooding itself with everything it had left. The numbers were not good. "I'll ask you once more," Cole Vance said, and the easy warmth had gone out of his voice entirely now, leaving something flat and patient underneath. "The phone, the keys, the cash, you hand them over, and I tie you up nice and warm by the fire, and I'm gone by morning. You make me work for it." He let the knife drift almost lazy toward the dark window and the screaming white beyond it. "And I put you out in that." Maggie believed him. That was the thing she would remember later, how completely she believed him. There was no bluff in him. He had said it the way a man reads a grocery list. She took a slow step back. Her heel found the raised oak threshold of the pantry doorway behind her, and a single thought went through her like a current. 3 feet past the island. Turn left. The rug. The seam. She knew the floor of her own house in the dark. She had built the knowing into her bones for exactly this, not for this, not for a man. She had never once imagined a man. But the body does not care what the rehearsal was for. The body only knows the steps. "All right," she said, and she let her voice shake, and it was not entirely an act. "All right, the phone's in the drawer. I'll get it," Vance said, and he matched her step for step, the knife tracking her like a compass needle. "Real slow, Margaret." She turned half toward the window drawer, her free hand rising as if to open it, and the mountain answered for her. It began as a crack. A single deafening report from somewhere up the slope behind the cabin, sharp as a rifle shot, but 100 times louder, the sound of living wood giving way. On the high ground above her property stood a lodgepole pine that had been dead 4 years, killed by the beetle blight that had grayed half the ridge. A 100-foot column of seasoned timber that Maggie had marked in her mind every spring and told herself she would have Silas come and drop before it fell on its own. She had never gotten around to it. The wind howling now at speeds that bent the whole forest flat, caught that dead tree at the precise angle and the precise moment, and the rotten base sheared through with a scream of splitting fiber, and 100 feet of frozen wood came down out of the dark directly onto the cabin Maggie Ridley had built to stand against anything. The impact was the end of the world. The ridgepole did not bend. It exploded. The steep A-frame roof she had pitched so carefully to shed the snow took the full weight of the falling pine across its spine and simply ceased to exist as a roof, became instead a storm of shattered timber and tearing insulation, and a wall of 3 feet of accumulated snow dumped at once into the room. The cast iron stovepipe sheared off at the ceiling and vomited a choking cloud of ash and smoke. The heavy beams she had bolted to bedrock tore loose at their joints with shrieks of bending steel. The concussion threw Maggie off her feet. She hit the kitchen floor hard, the skillet flying from her hand and ringing away into the dark, and the breath left her in a single punched-out gasp. Above her, the lanterns died, snuffed instantly by the avalanche of cold air and snow pouring through the ruined roof, and the cabin went black. Total, suffocating, roaring black. The wind that had been a muffled howl behind her walls was suddenly inside the room, with her screaming through the wound in the roof, dragging the 30 below cold down on top of her like a physical weight. Somewhere in the dark, very close, a man screamed. It was a wet, ragged sound, pain and rage braided together. Cole Vance, alive somewhere in the wreckage, the falling timber having found him too, but not finished the job. She heard him thrashing, heard debris hurled aside, heard over the shriek of the storm his voice rising into the dark hunting. "You, where are you? Where are you?" I was not crushed. He was alive, and he was hurt, and he was between her and the only thing in this collapsing world that could save her. And here, in the absolute dark, with snow filling the room like sand, pouring into an hourglass, and a wounded predator clawing through the ruins toward her. Here, Margaret Ridley did not scream. She did not freeze. 5 years of grief poured into concrete, 5 years of rehearsing the dark, finally fully came online. She rolled onto her stomach. She did not run because running meant noise, and noise meant the knife. She crawled, silent flat against the freezing floor, dragging herself through shattered glass and splintered wood toward a seam in the floor that no eye could find, and her hands could find blind. 3 feet past the island, her shoulder brushed the fallen cabinet. Turn left. Her fingers met the heavy weave of the pantry rug. She hauled it aside. Behind her, a flashlight beam stabbed into the dark. Vance had found his light. The white cone swept wildly through the swirling curtain of snow and ash lurching across the impossible wreckage of the living room. And it found, for one frozen instant, the massive pine trunk lying square across the sofa where he had been sitting only minutes before. Then it swung toward the kitchen. Maggie's hands raked across the wide oak plank fingers, scrabbling for the indent of the hidden latch there. She pressed it hard, and the spring-loaded lock clicked under her palm, and she heaved the 1/4-inch trapdoor up out of the floor. A breath of stale, frigid air rose from the black square beneath her. "I see you!" The beam caught her, caught the side of her face, her gray hair wild with frost, just as she swung her legs into the hole and her boots found the top rung of the steel ladder. Vance came over the wreckage in a lurching, furious charge, his boots smashing across the broken floorboards, the flashlight bouncing crazily, the knife. A flash of silver in its light. Maggie dropped. She went down the ladder in a controlled fall, her gloved hands burning against the freezing steel. Ignoring the scream of her shoulder, and she reached up and seized the iron handle on the underside of the trap door, and she pulled it down with everything 64 years of life had left in her. It slammed into its steel frame with a single enormous final note, a sound like a vault closing half a heartbeat before Vance's hands hit the floor where she had been. Maggie spun the internal locking wheel. 4 heavy steel deadbolts drove home into the reinforced concrete frame. Each one a solid mechanical thunk she felt in her teeth. And then she was falling the last few feet to the floor of the bunker, landing hard on the concrete, her chest heaving, gasping in the absolute pitch dark of the place she had built to save her life. Above her, the wood vibrated. Bang! 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 Vance kicking the trapdoor. She could hear him screaming through the steel, the words torn to muffled fragments by the quarter-inch plate and the foot of concrete obscenities, threats, the sounds a trapped animal makes at the bars. Maggie did not answer. She reached out blindly in the dark, her hand sliding along the cold concrete wall until it found the breaker she had set there for exactly this moment, and she flipped it. A string of low-watt LED strips stuttered caught and bathed the small room in a dull amber glow. The bunker was precisely as she had left it. The rations stood in their neat, rotated stacks. The Mylar bags lay folded in the corner. The gas monitor sat on its shelf with the patience of a machine. The ventilation pipe hummed somewhere above, drawing thin, cold air down the chimney shaft into the room. 10 feet by 10 feet of concrete and steel. Exactly the dimensions she had specified 5 years ago on a night when she had believed the only enemy was the weather. She had been so wrong about the enemy. But the fortress did not care. The fortress held. Above her, the kicking stopped. And then a new sound came, and it was worse than the kicking because it was patient. A slow, grinding scrape of metal against wood. Vance working the blade of his hunting knife into the seam around the trapdoor, hunting for purchase. "You can't stay down there forever." His voice drifted through the steel ragged now, but steadier than the screaming had been. "I'll pry this open, and if I can't..." The scraping paused. "I'll find gasoline. There's a generator can up here somewhere, isn't there, Margaret? You're an organized woman. I'll pour it down the cracks and smoke you out like a rat in a hole." Maggie stood in the center of her tomb, her breathing slowing, the terror draining out of her by degrees and leaving behind something harder and colder and clearer. She looked up at the trap door, at the seam he was working at. There were no cracks. She had built it flush machined to a tolerance he would never breach with a knife seated in a frame poured into bedrock. He could not pry it open, and he could not burn her out. There was nowhere for the fumes to gather, no gap wide enough to feed a fire, and the ventilation drew clean air down a shaft he would never find buried in the chimney. He could not reach her. She was safe from the man. She was safe from the storm. And it was only then, standing in the amber glow, with her heart finally slowing, that Margaret Ridley understood the true shape of the trap she had built for herself 5 years ago. She was safe. She was also entombed. 10 feet underground, beneath a collapsed cabin 22 miles from the nearest town, in the middle of a historic blizzard, with a man on top of her hatch who wanted her dead, and a body 64 years old that the cold was already beginning to reach. She had built a fortress to survive the end of her world. And the real test, she understood now, was only beginning. The silence that followed the slamming of the deadbolts was not silence at all. It was a thick, pressurized quiet, layered over with the muffled rhythm of Vance's knife scraping at the steel above, and beneath that deeper, the great roaring breath of the storm dragging itself across the ruined mountain. Maggie stood motionless in the amber light and let her breath plume in front of her face. She checked the tactical watch on her wrist, a habit and anchor, a way of holding on to the engineer when the widow wanted to scream. 11:10 p.m. The thermometer mounted on the bunker wall read 42 degrees. Survivable, for now. But she knew the number was already wrong, already falling, because the radiant heat of the wood stove that had warmed this concrete from above for 5 years was gone. Buried under 100 feet of frozen pine and the 30 below cold of the bitterroot, was leaning down through the bedrock with all the patience in the world. She made herself work the procedure. She had written it, laminated it, taped it to the shelf 5 years ago. Hydration first. Thermal regulation second. Atmosphere third. The hands shook, but the steps were the steps. She drank from a sealed bottle. She pulled a foil-lined mylar bag from the corner and draped it over the cot. She unboxed the small propane heater and seated a 1-pound cylinder against its valve. But she did not light it. Burning fuel in a sealed room ate oxygen and made poison, and she would not spend that card until she had to. And then she powered on the gas monitor, and its little screen glowed blue, and it told her the one thing she needed most to hear. Oxygen, 20.8%. She breathed out. The air was good. The air would stay good as long as the pipe stayed open. Above her, the scraping stopped. A heavy thud shook a thin sift of concrete dust down from the ceiling. Vance had thrown his weight against the door one last time and learned what she already knew. "I know you can hear me." His voice came down through the steel, and the rage in it had cracked finally into something else. "You crazy old woman. It's dropping up here. Do you understand me? The roof's gone. The walls are going. The wind's taking the whole place apart, and I'm sitting in it." A wet, hacking cough. "My fingers are numb. I can't feel my feet. You're going to sit down there and listen to me freeze." Maggie closed her eyes. She had not expected this. She had built her fortress against a man with a knife against a robber, a killer, and her fortress had held against him perfectly. what she had not built it against, what no wall of concrete could ever hold back. Back was the sound of a human being freezing to death 4 feet above her head. Because she had heard that sound before. Not heard, it imagined it, lived inside it for 5 years. A man trapped in the cold conscious, reaching alone, calling for help into a dark that would not answer. She had built this entire mountain, this entire life, out of the unbearable fact of it. And now the cold had arranged for her to sit in a concrete box and become herself the dark that would not answer. He brought this on himself, she whispered to the wall, and her jaw tightened around the words. He came here to rob you. He came here to kill you. He is not Vernon. You are not a rescue crew. You owe this man nothing. But the engineer who built her could not lie to herself. And the truth was this: the wall between mercy and murder is thinner than a 1/4 inch of steel, and she was sitting on the wrong side of it, and she knew it. She made herself speak. She crossed to the center of the room and tilted her face up toward the trapdoor. Vance. Her voice came back off the concrete harder than she felt. Listen to me. There's a cold-rated sleeping bag in the hall closet, if the tree missed it. There are chemical hand warmers in the top drawer of the kitchen island. They're in a steel box. They'll be intact. Get to them and burrow into the wreckage on the lee side out of the wind. That's how you survive the night. That's the only way you survive the night. A laugh drifted down through the floorboards. Bitter. Wrecked. The closet's under 2 tons of pine, lady. The island's buried. The wind's coming straight through where the living room used to be. Another cough, deeper. It's 30 below up here and falling. Open the door. Open the damn door. And we both live. I can't do that. You can. You just won't. You had a knife at my throat an hour ago. She said it without heat, which was somehow worse. You told me you'd put me out in the storm. You knew my name. You knew my house. You came here to take everything I have and leave me dead in the snow. And the only reason you're up there freezing instead of down here cutting me is that a tree fell. So no, not open this door. Maggie stepped back from the ladder. She wrapped her arms around herself and pulled the mylar blanket up over her shoulders, and she sat down on the edge of the cot, and she stared at the blue glow of the gas monitor. And she made herself do the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. She made herself wait. The human body, she knew, could not last long in that cold without shelter. A few hours, no more. By morning, Cole Vance would be gone, fled down the mountain on the buried snowmobile track he must have come up on, or dead in the wreckage above her. Either way, by morning, the kicking would stop. She had only to outlast a dying man. She had only to sit in her safe concrete box an arm's length from his freezing and do nothing and be saved by it. She had spent 5 years learning to survive. No one had ever told her it would feel exactly like committing a murder. By 1:30 in the morning, the kicking had stopped. For a long while, there was nothing at all but the storm and the slow tick of the cold deepening in the walls. The thermometer read 38 degrees now. Maggie sat under her blanket and watched her breath and let herself believe for the first time that it was over, that the man above her had crawled off into the wreckage to die or to flee, and that she had only the mountain to outlast now. Then she heard him moving again. Not kicking, not prying, something else. A slow, dragging scrape, and then a thud, and another. Heavy things pulled across the broken floor above her and dropped. Thump. Scrape. Thump. Maggie tilted her head, frowning, trying to read the sounds the way she read everything. He was moving debris, dragging the shattered floorboards, the broken furniture, the chunks of fallen roof, and stacking them on top of the trapdoor. For one wild moment, she thought he had given up, that he was burying the hatch out of pure spite, sealing her tomb so that even if she changed her mind, she could never climb out. Or insulating himself, perhaps building a den of debris over the one patch of floor that radiated a trace of warmth from the room below. Then a different sound reached her. It did not come from the ceiling. It came from the wall. A low metallic clink, followed by a hollow scraping that seemed to travel down through the concrete itself rather than through the floor above, a vibration she felt in her back teeth before she understood it. Maggie went very still on the cot. Her eyes moved slowly to the steel grate set into the wall near the ceiling, the mouth of the ventilation shaft, and her blood went to ice. When she had designed the bunker, she had lain awake nights over a single problem. Every other threat she could armor against cold fire force, a man with a knife. But she could not armor against the need to breathe. Air was the one thing that had to come in from the outside world, and so air was the one weakness she could never fully close. She had hidden it as well as a structure could hide anything. A 4-inch pipe run up through the dead center of the great stone chimney, terminating near the flue where no eye would find it from the ground. A small inline fan to draw the fresh air down. She had been proud of it. She had thought it perfect. But the falling pine had sheared the chimney off halfway up, and somewhere in that rubble, exposed now to the open air, the white plastic mouth of her ventilation pipe was waiting to be found. "Margaret!" Vance's voice did not come from the ceiling this time. It came from the grate in the wall, metallic and flattened and intimate, as if he were lying beside her in the dark with his lips against her ear. She came off the cot so fast the blanket fell to the floor. "Found your little breathing tube," Vance said through the pipe through the wall into the room. His teeth were chattering audibly now, his words slurring at the edges. The slur of a man slipping into hypothermia, the body shutting down the parts it could no longer afford. "Clever, real clever, running it up the chimney. I never would have found it. A wet, hitching breath. But you made a mistake, Margaret. You made one mistake. Vance, get away from that pipe. Maggie crossed to the wall, her hand reaching up toward the grate where a thin, steady stream of frigid, clean air had been pouring in all night. You don't want to do this. I'm so cold. His voice dropped almost dreamy, almost tender, and that was the most frightening thing of all. I'm so cold, and I'm going to die up here in the dark. You made sure of that. A pause, a long, terrible pause. So if I'm going down, you're coming with me. You're going to lie down there in your safe little box, and you're going to feel the air get thick, and you're going to know it was me. You're going to suffocate in the dark, Margaret, same as you're letting me freeze in it. The scraping resumed louder now, closer, the sound of something being forced down into the narrow pipe. He was packing it. Snow, broken drywall, splintered wood, anything he could cram into the 4-inch mouth, ramming it down with the blade of his knife. And as he packed it, the steady hum of the little inline fan changed pitch, climbing into a thin mechanical whine as it strained against the choking blockage. Maggie reached up and laid her bare fingers over the grate. The cold, clean stream of air was gone. Vance, stop. She heard her own voice crack, and she did not care. You'll kill us both. If I die down here, you understand what that means. The door never opens. Nobody pulls you out of the wreckage. We both die on this mountain, and nobody finds either of us till the thaw. Stop, please. There was no answer, only the sound of more debris being forced down the tube. And then, at last, a single heavy, solid thud. Something rammed home into the top of the pipe and tamped down hard. And then silence. Maggie stumbled back from the wall, her eyes going to the gas monitor on the shelf. Oxygen, 20.8%. Still good for now. But she stood in the center of a sealed concrete box, 1,000 cubic feet in volume, with no air coming in, and a body burning through what little there was with every frightened breath. And she did the arithmetic that her whole life had trained her to do. And the arithmetic was very simple and very cruel. It was only a matter of time. The siege had become a sentence. By 3:45 in the morning, the thermometer on the wall read 31 degrees, and Maggie could see her breath hanging in the air, long after she exhaled it slow to disperse in the dead, unmoving atmosphere of the room. But the cold was no longer the thing trying to kill her. The gas monitor woke her. She had not meant to sleep. She had meant only to rest her eyes, to conserve, to wait. But the body, 64 years old, drained of adrenaline, starved slowly of the oxygen it needed, had pulled her down into a thick gray fog without asking permission. And then the monitor's alarm cut through it, a sharp, piercing double beep that yanked her up out of the dark. She forced her eyes open. Her head was pounding a deep throbbing ache that wrapped around her temples and squeezed a vice tightening with every heartbeat. Her limbs felt heavy and far away, as if they belonged to someone else. Someone she was operating by remote control through a long delay. She squinted at the screen. CO2 levels rising. The carbon dioxide she exhaled with every breath had nowhere to go. It was filling the sealed room from the bottom up, an invisible flood, and long before the oxygen ran out. The poison of her own breathing would take her the headache first. Then the confusion, then the lethargy, then a sleep she would not wake from. She knew this. She had read every word of the literature 5 years ago in a bright apartment, certain she was being thorough about a problem that would never come. Think. You are an engineer. The problem has a solution. Find it. She dragged herself off the cot, and the room tilted, and she caught the shelf and held on until it steadied. The blockage was in the pipe. The blockage was 12 feet up at the top, where Vance had rammed it home. If she could clear it, if she could punch through whatever he'd packed in there, the fan would draw clean air again, and she would live. She had the tools. Of course she had the tools. She had thought of everything 5 years ago. She hauled the heavy canvas tool bag off the rack, and her stiff, clumsy fingers fought the zipper open. From inside, she pulled a bundle of fiberglass fish rods, rigid threaded poles, 3 feet each, the kind an electrician uses to push wire through a wall cavity. She unscrewed the grate from the wall and let it clatter to the floor, and she threaded 4 rods together into a single 12-foot lance. Her hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to seat the threads. "All right, Vance," she rasped, and her voice sounded strange and thick to her own ears. "Let's see how good you packed it." She fed the rod up into the dark mouth of the pipe. It slid easily for the first 8 feet, the fiberglass scraping the plastic walls. Then it stopped. Hard. Solid. She had hit the blockage. She set her feet, gripped the rod in both hands, and drove it upward with everything she had left. The rod flexed, bowed in the middle, and the blockage did not move. Maggie frowned through the pounding in her skull. She had expected snow-packed snow drywall dust, splintered wood things she could break apart with steady pressure. She leaned her ear against the open pipe and listened past the faint shriek of the wind far above, and she heard nothing. No shifting, no give. And then the understanding arrived, cold and complete, and it was worse than anything Cole Vance had said to her through the wall. He had not just packed the pipe, he had poured water down it, out of a canteen, out of melted snow, out of whatever he could find in his last lucid minutes. He had poured liquid water down into the snow and debris he'd rammed home, and in the 30 below air of the open chimney that water had done the only thing water does at 30 below. It had flash frozen. The blockage in her pipe was not snow. It was a solid plug of ice, a foot of it locked into the plastic walls like a cork, driven into a bottle and then welded there. She could not push through it. She could not break it. A man freezing to death in the dark had reached down into the one weakness she could never fully close, and he had sealed it with the very thing that had killed her husband. The cold had finished the job. It had always been going to finish the job. Maggie yanked the rod back down out of the pipe, and it came loose, and she stood there, holding 12 feet of useless fiberglass. And for the first time in 5 years, the disciplined exterior she had built around her grief cracked clean through, and the panic poured in cold and bright. She was trapped. Truly, completely, hopelessly trapped by the storm above, by the dead man's spite, by the perfect concrete tomb she had built with her own 2 hands and stocked with everything a person could need to survive, except the one thing she could not manufacture down here in the dark. The monitor beeped again. She turned her swimming eyes to it. Oxygen. Her vision blurred at the edges, the amber light smearing into long, soft streaks. The headache had become a hammer, rhythmic, enormous, falling on the same spot behind her eyes again and again. She stumbled back to the cot and folded down onto it and pulled her knees up toward her chest, the way she had not done since she was a girl. "Vernon," she whispered into the thickening dark. A tear cut a hot line down her freezing cheek, and she did not have the strength to wipe it away. "Vernon, I'm sorry. I thought I built it strong enough. I thought if I just made it strong enough." For the next hour, Margaret Ridley drifted at the edge of the dark. The light in the bunker seemed to shift. Amber bleeding into a sick, bruised violet, the same color as the sky. Before the storm, though she could not have said whether the change was in the room or in her own dying eyes. She smelled impossibly the cologne her husband had worn for 38 years. She heard far away the blare of car horns on a frozen highway, the sound of a wreck she had never witnessed and yet had lived inside every night since. The bunker, her fortress, her great work, had become the very thing she had spent her whole life trying to escape. Oxygen, 17.5%. The sound jolted her up off the cot, gasping, sucking at air that felt thick and useless and warm in her lungs. Air that gave her nothing. Her heart slammed. Her hands tingled numb at the fingertips. She knew somewhere under the fog. The engineer still knew that if the number fell below 15, she would lose consciousness, and that if she lost consciousness down here, she would never open her eyes again. She had one option left. She had to open the door. It was madness. It was the one thing she had sworn she would not do. Opening the trap door meant the 30 below hurricane above the buried wreckage, the open dark. And it meant Cole Vance. Cole Vance, who had begged and threatened and then sealed her in to die. Cole Vance, who might be lying dead in the snow above her, or might be sitting cross-legged on the debris pile with his hunting knife across his knees, waiting with the last of his strength for exactly this moment. For the moment, her own dying lungs would force her up out of the ground and into his reach. But staying sealed was not a risk. Staying sealed was a certainty. Maggie dragged herself off the cot. Her legs were filled with wet sand. She crossed the 4 feet to the ladder, and it might have been 4 miles. She set her boot on the bottom rung and began to climb, and the effort of it made the room spin and the siren scream, and her vision tunneled down to a single point of amber light. At the top, she pressed her ear to the cold steel of the trap door and made herself listen one last time past the roar of the storm. There was nothing, no pacing, no scraping, no coughing, no begging. Cole Vance had been silent for hours, dead then, or gone, or waiting. There was no way to know. There was only the siren and the thick, useless air, and the number falling toward 15. "It's now or never," she whispered, and her own voice was barely there. She set both hands on the heavy internal locking wheel, and she strained against it. The mechanism, stiff with cold, fought her, groaned, refused, and then with a harsh metallic clack, the 4 deadbolts retracted from the concrete frame all at once. The door was unlocked. The only thing holding it down now was its own 1/4-inch weight, and whatever Cole Vance had piled on top of it in the dark. Maggie braced her feet on the rungs, locked her elbows, set her shoulders against the cold steel above her, and with the last full breath her dying body could find, she pushed up into the dark, into the storm, into the wreckage, into whatever was waiting on the other side of the only wall she had left. The door did not move. For one black, airless instant, Margaret Ridley hung there on the ladder with her shoulders jammed against 1/4-inch steel and 100 pounds of frozen debris pressing back down on her. And she felt the last of her strength begin to drain out through her arms, and she thought, this is how it ends. Not with the knife, not even with the cold, with a door that will not open, and a body too old and too starved of air to make it. Then the engineer spoke one last time through the fog. Not strength, leverage. She dropped down 2 rungs. She repositioned her boots, wedged her back against the ladder rail, and instead of pushing straight up, she drove with her legs, the largest muscles she had left, and threw her whole 64 years into a single upward heave. A guttural scream tearing out of her that she did not recognize as her own voice. The door shifted 1 inch, 2, and through that 2-inch gap came a blast of air so cold it felt like being struck, but it was clean, it was clean. It smelled of pine sap and wood smoke and snow, and her starving lungs seized on it and dragged it down, and the fog in her skull tore open like a curtain. She pushed again. The debris on top of the hatch slid, shifted, gave way. The trapdoor swung up and over on its iron hinges and crashed back against the ruined floor above. and an avalanche of plaster and shattered wood and clumps of snow poured down into the bunker over her head and shoulders. And the storm rushed in to fill the room, and as it rushed in, it sucked the dead, poisoned air out, and Maggie clung to the top rung of the ladder, with her face turned up to the open dark, and breathed and breathed and breathed. It tasted like being born. For a long moment, that was all there was. The cold, the air, the wild relief of a body pulled back from the edge. The siren of the gas monitor still shrieking below her, pointless now, drowning in the wind that screamed through the wound in the roof. Then her vision cleared, and she looked up into the ruins of her home. The roof above the kitchen was simply gone, torn open to the violent black sky. Snow swirling down through the gap in slow vortices. The great pine lay through the center of everything, like a spear thrown by something that hated her. And there, lying directly beside the open mouth of the trapdoor, half buried under a mound of snow and broken timber, Cole Vance. He was not holding a knife. He was not waiting to ambush her. I was curled into a tight fetal knot, knees drawn to his chest, arms locked around them, the way a body curls when it is trying to keep the last of its warmth at the very center of itself and losing. His skin was a mottled blue-gray, the color the body turns when the blood has retreated from the surface to defend the heart. And then the heart had lost too. His eyes were open, wide open, staring sightless into the falling snow. Frost had crystallized along his eyelashes in fine white lace, and along his lips and across the stubble of his cheeks. Cole Vance had frozen to death. The predator who had stalked her cabin for a week, who had walked through her front door wearing the face of a dying man, who had begged her and threatened her and finally sealed her in a concrete box to suffocate. He had been killed not by Margaret Ridley, not by her trap or her hand, but by the very thing she had spent 5 years of her life trying to conquer. The cold, the mountain, the indifferent, patient cold that did not care who deserved it. He had sealed her vent in his last lucid minutes, and then he had lain down in the wreckage 4 feet above the woman he meant to kill, and he had frozen exactly the way her husband had frozen, exactly the way she had spent 5 years vowing no one she could save would ever freeze again. Maggie stared at him, her chest heaving, snow settling in her gray hair. She felt no triumph. She had expected somewhere in the back of her dying mind that she would feel triumph, that if she lived and he died, she would feel some hard, clean satisfaction. But there was none. There was only the cold and the body of a man, and the enormous gray indifference of the storm that had killed him as carelessly as it had killed the best man she'd ever known. The siege was over, and Margaret Ridley was still alive. She pulled herself the rest of the way out of the hole, her boots finding the frost-coated oak of the ruined pantry floor. And she knelt for a moment in the wreckage of her home and simply breathed, letting the clean, killing air fill her, letting the trembling work itself out of her arms. She could not stay here. The thought arrived slowly through the exhaustion, but it arrived with the old engineer's clarity. The bunker's air was breathable again. Now the poison had vented up through the open hatch into the storm. But the open hatch was also dumping the 30 below cold straight down into the only shelter she had left. The cabin was gone. The wood stove was buried. The night was not over. And there was one more thing she needed to know before she could think about surviving until dawn. She needed to know what else Cole Vance had brought into her home, and whether he had truly come alone. She crawled to the frozen body. It was like approaching a piece of furniture, a thing the storm had made and left behind. Her fingers, stiff inside her wool gloves, patted down the rigid frost-armored parka, and she made herself be thorough the way she was thorough about everything. The left pocket held something heavy and metallic and rectangular. She drew it out. A spare magazine, fully loaded. 9mm pistol rounds, 15 of them brass, dull in the swirling snow. Maggie went still. A spare magazine meant a pistol. A pistol she had never seen him draw because the falling tree had taken it before he could, or because he had simply never needed it, had played the freezing victim well enough that the knife had been theater and the gun, the truth, he'd kept in reserve. A man does not carry a spare magazine for a hunting trip. A man carries a spare magazine when he expects the work to be more than one clip can finish. The lethal intent was not in question anymore. It never had been, but now it had a number. 30 rounds. He had come prepared to kill more than once. She kept searching. The right breast pocket held something hard and bulky. She unzipped it with fingers that would barely answer her, and she pulled out a rugged black two-way radio, a real one, a long-range tactical unit with a stubby antenna and a digital channel display. The screen was cracked, spider-webbed, probably shattered when he'd scrambled over the wreckage in the dark. But a small green LED still blinked slow and stubborn on the top of the housing. The radio was on, and Margaret Ridley felt a new kind of cold pool in her stomach, a cold that had nothing to do with the air because she understood what the radio meant before her mind had fully formed the thought. A man desperate for shelter on a solo elk hunt does not carry a multi-channel long-range tactical radio. A man carries one of those when he is talking to somebody. As if it had heard the thought, the radio hissed. A burst of static, sharp and sudden, cutting clean through the howl of the storm. And then a voice, distorted, shivering, threaded with an impatience that was its own kind of cold. Cole! Cole, you copy! Come back! Maggie's thumb froze a half inch above the rubber transmit button. She did not breathe. Damn it, Cole. The voice crackled again, louder, closer to anger now. It's me. I'm stuck at the lower switchback, the plow trucks buried to the mirrors. I had to ditch the sled in a 6-foot drift a mile down, freezing my hide off out here. A pause, a wet sniff. Did you secure the place? You square the old woman away, 'cause I need to know if I'm walking 2 miles uphill in this for a warm fire and the cash, or if I'm walking into a locked door and a problem. Answer me. Over. Maggie dropped the radio back into the snow as if it had burned her hand. Cole Vance had not come alone. Cole Vance had never been a lost hunter, never been a desperate man caught in a freak storm. He had been half of something. And the other half was 2 miles down the mountain right now, fighting the same lethal whiteout that had just frozen his partner solid, and he was coming. The blizzard was not an accident either, she understood with a sick lurch. The blizzard was the plan. A historic, paralyzing storm was the perfect cover. Any missing widow, any bodies, the spring thaw eventually surrendered would be written off without a second look as one more tragedy of a winter that had killed plenty of people who had every right to be exactly where they were. She had been chosen, researched, targeted by 2 men, and by someone she thought again with the old cold certainty who had stood on this very ground 5 years ago with concrete dust on his hands and watched her hide her life away, one drawer at a time. She picked the radio back up out of the snow. She held it, and she made herself think the wind tearing at her the frozen body of one man at her knees, and the live voice of another in her palm. The man on the radio. The second man was stuck. Sled buried. Truck buried. 2 miles down a mountain and in a storm fierce enough to kill. He might not make it. The same cold that had taken Cole Vance might take him too, somewhere on the switchbacks, and solve her problem for her. But she could not count on it. She had counted on the cold to be her ally once tonight already, and it had nearly buried her. She would not make that mistake twice. She thumbed the volume on the radio all the way down to silence, and she dropped it into her own coat pocket, and Margaret Ridley began in the wreckage of everything she had built to plan. First, she had to survive the night. The hatch was the problem. Open it bled her shelter to 30 below. Closed flush it would sear with no ventilation. The ice plug Vance had welded into the pipe was still up there in the broken chimney, immovable, and within hours she would be back in the airless dark, suffocating on her own breath. Either extreme killed her. She needed something between them. She needed the engineer in her set a controlled exchange, a semi-permeable envelope, a microclimate. She had spent her whole life making things hold against forces that wanted them to fail. She was not going to stop now. She waded through the thigh-deep snow that had filled the ruined cabin, moving fast against the cold, and she salvaged 2 heavy wooden dining chairs intact, spared by the way the tree had fallen. A thick canvas drop cloth from the hall the one she'd used painting the guest room 2 summers ago. Balled in a closet, the timber had somehow missed. From the bunker below, she brought up 3 mylar emergency blankets and a roll of heavy cloth tape. She set the 2 chairs over the open mouth of the trapdoor, backs out, and draped the canvas across them, building a low tent over the hole. She weighted its skirts down all around with broken chunks of concrete and roof timber so the wind could not tear it away. Then she taped the 3 mylar sheets to the underside of the canvas, silver side down, a reflective ceiling, an insulation layer, a thing to throw warmth back down into the hole instead of letting it climb out and vanish into the storm. It was crude. It was beautiful. It was thermodynamics, the same brutal laws she had served her whole career, bent for once to keep her breathing. She climbed back down the ladder into the bunker. The wall thermometer had crashed to 18 degrees. She reached up and pulled the trapdoor down behind her, but she did not let it seat flush. She wedged a solid 2x4 block of dunnage into the frame, holding the heavy steel up off its seal by a precise 2 inches. 2 inches! She had stood in this room 5 years ago, doing arithmetic about cubic feet and air exchange, and never once imagined she'd be doing it for her life. 2 inches was wide enough to let the heavier, deadly carbon dioxide spill out at the floor and fresh air seep in beneath the tent above. Narrow enough to throttle the murderous flood of sub-zero wind down to a trickle. She lit the propane heater. The piezo clicked, and a blue and orange flame sputtered up, and warmth, actual living warmth, bloomed against the gray concrete walls for the first time in hours. She set it dead center, clear of anything that could catch, and she sank onto the cot and pulled the cold-rated bag up around her shoulders, and she fixed her swimming eyes on the gas monitor and watched. The numbers shifted. Oxygen climbed back to 20.1% and held. The carbon dioxide fell out of the red down through the yellow into the green. The mylar above caught the heater's rising warmth and folded it back into the slow exchange, and the thermometer crept up 22, 28, 35, 40 degrees. A precarious, delicate, dangerous balance. A knife's edge of life held open exactly 2 inches wide. It held. She had outsmarted the mountain. For one more night, she had outsmarted the mountain. And then the radio in her pocket shrieked. She'd forgotten to leave the volume down. The voice of the second man filled the small concrete room, and Maggie's whole body jerked. "Cole, answer the damn radio." The voice was wrecked now, slurring the cold, working on it the way it had worked on his partner. "I can't. I found a rock overhang down by the creek. I'm getting out of the wind. Can't see 10 feet. Can't feel my hands." A long, shuddering breath. "I'm hunkering down till it lets up. I'll make my push at first light. You better have coffee on and that cash-bagged brother. First light. Over." Then static. Then nothing. Maggie held the radio in both hands and stared at the green LED in the dark. First light. She checked her watch. 5:40 in the morning. Maybe 6 hours until the gray came up over the eastern ridge. 6 hours to rest a body that had nearly died twice tonight. And then a second man, armed, she had to assume, with the partner of the pistol, whose spare magazine sat in her pocket, would come up the mountain looking for a warm fire and a dead old woman. He would find neither. Margaret Ridley pulled the bag over her head, let the steady hiss of the propane drown the storm, and closed her eyes. But she did not sleep, not really. She lay in the warm dark, and she did the thing she had done all her life. She looked at the structure she had been handed, the wreckage, the storm, the hatch, the man who was coming, and she began beam by beam to design the way it would hold, or rather the way it would fail. Because that she understood now with a clarity the long, terrible night had given her was the secret she had been circling for 5 years. She had spent her whole career making things stand up. But she knew better than any soul alive the precise point at which a structure could no longer bear what was placed upon it and broke. She knew where the weak point was. She had built one into this very house with her own hands and marked it in her mind and told herself it didn't matter. The pantry floor, the short span joists over the cellar hatch, strong enough to walk on, strong enough to stack shelves on, not built to the brutal standard of the rest of the house. The one place in her fortress where the structure gave a little. And around that weak point, the storm had arranged everything she needed. A man coming up the mountain who did not know the floor was different there. A trap door she could open and close. A foot of treacherous black ice that had built up across the ruined pantry boards through the long night. And a heavy steel hatch on iron hinges that swung up out of the floor like the lid of a thing waiting to close. Maggie lay in the warm dark, and she stopped grieving, and she started engineering. Outside, the second man huddled under his rock and waited for the light. He had no idea that the old woman he was coming to kill had spent 31 years learning exactly how to break a thing on purpose. The transition from night to day in a blizzard is not marked by a sunrise. It is marked by the sky going from impenetrable black to a flat, blinding, featureless gray. At 7:30, Maggie woke to a sound she had not heard in 18 hours. Silence. The wind that had torn at the mountain all night long had finally exhausted itself. The quiet was so total, it made her ears ring. The propane had burned through its cylinder hours before and gone out, and the bunker sat at a hard 35 degrees. But she was alive, and the air was good. And outside, beyond the tent of canvas and mylar, the storm had finally died. Every joint in her body screamed as she pushed up off the cot. She checked the monitor safe. She checked the radio silent. She pushed the wedge clear and heaved the trapdoor open and climbed up through the tent into the ruins of her home. And the world had changed. The clouds had broken in the night and slid east off the peaks, and above the Bitterroot arched a sky of such piercing crystalline blue that it hurt to look at. The sun was up over the eastern ridge, low and brilliant, and it set the whole buried landscape on fire. A blinding white country of fresh snow drifted smooth and deep over everything untouched, beautiful, and utterly without mercy. Her cabin was a shattered shell filled to the windowsills with glittering powder. The great pine lay through the heart of it, and Cole Vance's body was gone from sight, buried in the night's fresh snowfall, marked only by a smooth, unnatural mound near the pantry, a low white grave that the storm had dug for him without being asked. Maggie did not let herself look at it long. There was work to do, and the light was coming, and somewhere down the mountain, a man was waking up under a rock and getting ready to climb. First light! He had said first light. She waded to the kitchen island and dug down through the snow into the bottom drawer, and her gloved hands closed on the thing she had been saving for the one emergency she had always believed would be weather and never imagined would be men. A satellite messenger. A small, rugged orange device, an SOS beacon that could punch a distress signal and her exact coordinates straight up to a satellite and down again to the search and rescue dispatch in the valley. She had not used it in the night. She had known better. The thick cloud cover and the screaming storm would have swallowed the signal, and even if the message had somehow gotten through, no helicopter on Earth could have flown into that wind. The beacon was useless in a blizzard. It was a tool for the after. But the storm was gone now. The sky was open and blue and still. She waded out onto the broken porch, raised the device toward that brilliant emptiness, flipped up the protective cover, and pressed and held the SOS button. A light flashed red. Then it pulsed, searching. And then, after a few seconds that felt like a year, it glowed a steady, solid green. The message was out. The mountain knew where she was. Help was coming. But help Margaret Ridley knew better than any living soul could not always come in time. She turned back to the ruins and got to work. She knew the rescue helicopter, if one could even launch this fast, was 40 minutes out, at best more likely an hour. She knew the second man was 2 miles down a mountain on snowshoes, and that 2 miles through 3 feet of fresh powder, even for a strong man, was the better part of an hour too. It was going to be close. It was going to be a race between the men coming to save her and the man coming to kill her. And she had learned tonight not to bet her life on anyone else winning a race for her. So she would not wait to be saved. She would do what she had always done. She would make the structure hold. She moved fast, ignoring the screaming in her joints, working from the plan she had drawn in the warm dark. She climbed down into the bunker and propped the heavy trapdoor wide open on its hinges so that it stood up out of the pantry floor, like the raised lid of a steel box. And the black square of the 10-foot drop yawned open beside it. Then she took a bucket from the bunker, filled it at the hand pump, and climbed back up. And she poured water across the ruined pantry boards around the open hatch. Water that hit the 30 below wood and flashed instantly to a sheet of black ice, slick as oiled glass, exactly the way Vance's water had frozen in her pipe and nearly killed her. She was using his own lesson against the man who came after him. the pantry floor, the weak, short-span joists over the hatch. She had taken a salvaged length of timber and pried at them in the dark before dawn until she felt the give in them, felt them ready, felt them poised. The point where a little more load than they were built for would finish the job she'd started. A man's weight, a running man's weight. A man lunging across a floor he did not know was different there. And then she took up a position behind the half-collapsed log wall at the edge of the living room where she could see the long buried driveway and the tree line beyond it. And she gripped the heavy cast-iron skillet she had carried with her all through the night, and she waited. She did not have to wait long. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound carried for half a mile in the dead, windless morning. The deep, even rhythm of a man breaking trail on snowshoes through fresh powder. Margaret Ridley, 64 years old, sank lower behind her broken wall and breathed slow and watched the tree line. He came out of the timber at the foot of the driveway, 50 yards off, a man in a blaze orange hunting jacket and heavy snow gear, a rifle slung across his back. He stopped dead when the cabin came into view, and even at that distance she could see the shock take him. The way his head went back at the sight of the apocalyptic wreck of the A-frame, the missing roof, the great pine lying through the heart of it. He unclipped a radio from his chest harness. Coal. His voice carried thin and clear across the snow. Cole, what in God's name happened to the roof? Cole, talk to me. Are you in there? And Margaret Ridley made a choice. She drew the dead man's radio from her pocket, and with her thumb she turned the volume all the way up, and she keyed nothing, said nothing. She simply let it sit live in the silent, sunlit, snow-deadened morning. The second man's voice came out of the radio in her hand at full volume, echoing out of the ruined cabin like a shout from inside a tomb. Are you in there? The man in the orange jacket stopped as if he had walked into a wall. She watched the understanding hit him, watched his head snap toward the sound of his own voice booming out of the wreckage where his partner should have been holding a dead radio in a dead hand. Watched his free hand fly to the sling of his rifle and drag the weapon around to his front. Who's in there? His voice cracked, the cold confidence gone out of it all at once. Who's got Cole's radio? Where is he? He started forward, fast. The fear in him had turned to something uglier, and he came across the buried yard toward the cabin with the rifle up at his shoulder. Snowshoes hammering the powder. His eyes locked on the black hole where the front of her home used to be. I know somebody's in there, he shouted, climbing over the wreckage of the porch boots, crunching, swinging the muzzle across the ruins. Come out where I can see you, or I start shooting into the dark, and we'll see what I hit. He came over the broken threshold into the ruined cabin, and he did exactly what Margaret Ridley had spent the gray hour before dawn designing him to do. He saw the open trapdoor. She had counted on it, had counted on the one thing she knew about men like him, that they could not resist a hole in the ground. A black square in the floor of a wrecked cabin, a raised steel lid, a bunker door standing open. He had come for a cache and a satellite phone and a hidden old woman, and here was the hiding place, gaping open, and his partner nowhere. And he did the thing a hunting man does when the quarry has gone to ground. He went to the hole. He crossed the pantry floor in 3 fast strides, and on the 3rd stride, his boots hit the sheet of black ice she had poured across the boards, and the snowshoes that had carried him 2 miles up the mountain became on slick ice. Exactly what she had needed them to be. Long, clumsy, unsteerable blades with no edge and no grip. His feet shot out from under him. He pitched forward, arms flying wide, the rifle swinging up at the sky, and he came down hard onto the weak, short-span boards over the hatch, the one place in her whole fortress where the structure gave. They had been waiting all night for exactly this. The pre-stressed joists, pried to the edge of failure before dawn, took a falling man's full weight and let go. The floor opened beneath him with a crack of breaking pine, and the second man, the man who had come to kill her. The last of the storm, with a heartbeat, dropped straight down through the floor into the black 10-foot mouth of the bunker she had built with her own 2 hands, and hit the concrete at the bottom with a sound she felt in the soles of her feet. The rifle skittered away across the ruined floor above, out of the hole, out of his reach. Maggie was already moving. She came around the broken wall and crossed the slick floor on the balls of her feet, sure-footed where he had not been, because she knew every inch of it, and she reached the open hatch and looked down into her own bunker, at the man crumpled at the bottom of it. Alive, stunned, one leg bent wrong beneath him, groping in the amber light for a weapon that was no longer his. She did not climb down. She did not gloat. She did not give him the chance to find his footing, or his breath, or his nerve. She seized the heavy steel trapdoor in both hands, threw all the weight of her body into it, and swung it down. It crashed shut over the hole with the single enormous vault door note she had heard once already that night, but this time from the other side, this time with her on top and the predator below. She spun the external override and drove the deadbolts home. 4 solid mechanical thunks she felt in her teeth, and she sat down hard on the steel lid in the snow, and the sunlight gasping the cast iron skillet still clutched in one hand and never even needed. From beneath the floor, muffled by a foot of concrete and a 1/4 inch of steel, came the sound of a man beginning to scream. She let him scream. She had spent a night down there listening to a dead man tell her she would suffocate in the dark. She knew the bunker better than anyone on earth. She knew the air was good. She'd propped it herself before dawn. She'd vented it through the night. There was no ice plug in the pipe from the inside, only from the top, and the open chimney above breathed clean. He would not freeze. He would not suffocate. He would simply sit in a concrete box that he could not open, that no knife could pry and no strength could breach. And he would wait exactly the way he had meant for her to wait, until other men came and decided what to do with him. She had not killed him. She had done something she understood far better than killing. She had made a structure, and she had let a man's own weight bring it down on him. The old engineer had broken a thing on purpose, and the thing had been a trap, and the trap had held. Then she heard it, distant at first, a low rhythmic thumping off the canyon walls. Whomp, whomp, whomp. Growing, deepening, becoming the unmistakable mechanical roar of heavy rotor blades. And over the southern ridge, banking hard toward the green flash of her beacon's coordinates, came the bright red and white chassis of a Montana search and rescue helicopter. Maggie Ridley got slowly to her feet on top of the sealed hatch. The downdraft hit her as the helicopter swung over the clearing, a hurricane of its own, kicking up a blinding cloud of powder. And she stood in the white storm of it and raised both arms and waved. In the open side door, a man in a harness leaned out and saw her and gave her a thumbs up, and she felt something in her chest that she had not felt in 5 years finally slowly let go. The rescue had come. But the rescue had come second. The man under the floor was already caught by her hands, by 31 years of knowing exactly how things break. The helicopter would carry her down off the mountain, and dispatch would send deputies up the grade behind a plow to pull a stunned and broken man out of a concrete box and read him his rights for what he and his partner had planned and what they had done. But it was she who had ended it. Not the cavalry, not the cold, not luck. Her. The hoist came down. The rescue swimmer dropped into the snow beside her and shouted something against the rotor wash, his hands already moving to get a harness around her, and she let him, and she let herself be guided toward the cable. But at the lip of the open clearing, she stopped and looked back one last time at the wreckage of the house she had built, past the smooth white mound where one man had frozen to death, past the slick black ice, down at the sealed steel square in the ruined floor where the second man's muffled screaming had finally gone quiet. She had built that bunker terrified that the cold would reach through every wall the world put up and take her, the way it had taken Vernon, alone trapped freezing in the dark, waiting for a help that could not come. She had poured 5 years of grief into concrete and steel because she believed that isolation and steel were the same thing as safety. She had believed that if she just made the walls thick enough, she would finally be safe. But the walls had not saved her. The walls had nearly become her tomb. The fortress she'd built to keep death out had sealed her in with it. The concrete and the steel had not been the thing that pulled her back from the edge of the dark twice in one impossible night. What had saved her was the mind that built them, the mind that when the blueprints failed and the air went bad and the cold came pouring in, refused to lie down and wait. What had saved her was the refusal, the clarity under the worst the world could do, the choice made over and over in the dark to think instead of break. She had spent 5 years building a place to hide from the storm. She understood now with the rotor wash, freezing the tears on her face, and the brilliant blue Montana sky, arching over the ruins of everything she'd made, that hiding had never once been the same thing as living. She would rebuild. She knew that already standing in the snow. She had the skill, she had the will, and she had, for the first time in 5 years, the reason. But this time, she would not build a fortress. She would not pour her fear into the ground and call it safety. She would not dig herself a tomb and mistake it for a home. This time, she would build a place with windows that let the light in. This time, she would build a place to live. The swimmer's hand closed firm on her shoulder, and the cable drew taut, and Margaret Ridley turned her face up toward the open sky and let the mountain let her go.